Hello, everyone. Welcome to Module 7's live Q&A session for Tech for Good, the role of ICT in achieving the SDGs. This week's expert session will be with Jessica Espey. She's a senior advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network and director of SDSN Trends, which is our thematic research network on data and statistics. My name's Shannon. I'm one of the team members here at the SDG Academy, and I'll be moderating this session. We've had some great questions this week, and I've selected a few for Jessica to answer, but first I'll let her introduce herself.
Great. Hi. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining and also for your interest in this course and this module. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. So as I introduced in the module, I'm Jessica Espey. I'm a senior advisor to the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, but I'm also the director of SDSN Trends, which is our data program. So we're an expert advisory group comprised of about 30 leading data scientists from around the world who are particularly doing research and new thinking on evolving data governance. So in this world of big data and big tech, how do we govern and regulate all of these new sources of information so we can put them to use for the public good? So that's my background, and it's great to be with you all today. And thank you to that many of you who've already submitted some great questions. So I'm looking forward to jumping into the discussion. Great, back to you, Shannon.
Sorry, went on mute there. My apologies. So our first question is, in your opinion, given your background and your work in this field, what is the most difficult type of data to collect or collate and present accurately?
Sorry, I'm unmuting myself. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think every single type of data has its own unique challenges. For a range of reasons: collecting it, collating it, cleaning it, analyzing it, and so on and so forth. I'd say the area, the type of data that is probably hardest from a public policy government perspective is administrative data. So if you're a government and you are trying to monitor your performance on sustainable development or on public service delivery or so on, it's quite easy to not easy, but it's perfectly feasible to implement a policy or a program and then do a household survey to sort of see the impact. What's much harder to collate and analyze in real time, or at least in a timely fashion, is administrative data. Administrative data is the data that's collected from services and facilities as things happen. So in a hospital, it's the data that's collected about your particular background, your illness, your concerns, your well-being, your progress with your treatment, and your other vital statistics. And to keep that being updated constantly in a timely fashion and sent back to a central ministry, so in this case, let's say a Ministry of Health, to collate and analyze and share with government. So that's the kind of real-time information that governments need to make very timely and informed policy decisions. But it's quite dependent on very efficient systems and ideally having good ICT connection, so good internet connection and a good platform in order to house and communicate that administrative data. So it really is one of the biggest challenges. It's also one of the areas it's least invested in. It's very easy for a donor or a government to fund a survey or to collect data from a satellite program or to look at different types of Earth observation data for particular purposes. It's much harder to know how you invest in building a comprehensive system of data collection across a whole of government. So administrative data is probably the trickiest area and the trickiest type of data to work with.
And just a follow-up to that, would you say that things like health data and other types of administrative data would be particularly sensitive in terms of privacy and data rights?
That's an interesting question. Yes, it can be, because obviously you're collecting individual information about vital statistics, age, gender, marital status, income, all that kind of stuff. But you're also collecting potentially health data, ethnicity information, if it's interesting and useful for medical purposes. And so, yes, I mean, you need to be able to make sure that that individual data is highly anonymized, so that the government doesn't have a kind of very comprehensive, detailed record of every individual accessible to multiple different departments of government. So it is a very hard area to do effectively and to regulate well, if you're going to have a kind of comprehensive administrative system across government. And that's an area, for that reason, we see things like the biotech revolution in India. So now in India, there are national ID cards and there's a biometric data collection system for civil registration, which means you give fingerprint data and iris scan data to the government, in addition to your passport information, your nationality, your residency, your family descriptions, and so on. So the government is holding on to very, very personal, unique data for every individual, which is quite controversial, because if there were ever a breach in security, that data could be readily exploited by any number of people for nefarious purposes. So it can be very challenging, and consequently, that's why it's so important to invest in building a really strong system across the whole of government, which makes it hard to both support and also to use.
All right, thank you. Our next question asks sort of about the levels of data. And so this learner asked, when studying the state of the world from the perspective of the SDGs, is it more valuable to have a finer, more granular perspective on the world's nations rather than the rough division between so-called developed and developing countries? And this learner cites, for example, Gapminder, which was the subject of Module 7's discussion activity. And they divide the world into sort of geographic regions: the Americas, Africa, Europe, and then Asia, Oceania. So I guess it's a matter of how do we categorize information to make international or regional comparisons in a way that's useful?
Yeah, again, another good question. And I think this is more a question of politics than data necessarily, or technology. But yes, I think it's fair to say that the developed developing dichotomy is old hat and not very relevant anymore. And I do think actually that very rarely do we see it being used nowadays in any kind of form of analysis or discussion. We do differentiate often between high-income countries, middle-income countries, and low-income countries. We also differentiate between countries that might be IDA recipients, so recipients of loans or grants from the World Bank or other monetary funds, so therefore are kind of dependent on international support. But those are much more useful classifications than developed versus developing. I mean, the whole world, in the context of sustainable development, we are all developing countries. No country has cracked this issue. No country has minimized their carbon emissions to a great enough level. No country's eradicated relative poverty. So it's a crude distinction and is not really relevant. So yes, in terms of when we're doing analysis of different regions across the world, we do use continental divisions, as Gapminder did. More and more, it's just country by country. You might want to look at SDSN's SDG index, which is a country by country, essentially a rank of performance on different dimensions of the SDGs. But we also consider by different continents. And there's a very nuanced discussion in particular about OECD performance, recognizing that although they might be classed as developed countries, there is huge distinction within those countries, and actually using that sort of assumption that by being high income and having eradicated absolute poverty, you're doing fine, is actually completely wrong. Because when you break it down, you can see that many of the OECD countries are severely lagging behind in a great many dimensions, including inequality and relative poverty, as well as environmental concerns. So yes, you're absolutely right. And fortunately, less and less we're seeing that kind of developed versus developing argument or types of analysis being used, because it's really not relevant in this day and age.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think we make a good point about that developed versus developing really doesn't get at sort of the deeper issues and the divisions within countries as well. And just for everyone listening, you can find the SDG index, SDSN's SDG index that just mentioned, in the additional resources to Module 1, or I believe it's sdgindex.org. Is the website where you can find all that information, and that just ranks every country's performance on all 17 of the SDGs, and it's got a stoplight system, sort of red, yellow, and green for how well they're doing on various SDGs. So sort of the next question sort of relates to this as well, and measuring SDGs, and it says, In this module on data and statistics, we've looked at examples of how several of the SDGs have been evaluated, where there are correlations between the values. Say that the SDGs should be seen as a whole. For instance, in developed countries such as Sweden, the values of individual SDGs are all high, while in maybe a less developed country, some of the SDGs all have low values, and is there a correlation between that? So can you talk a little bit more about how the indicators of a lot of the SDGs sort of relate to each other, and how we can see patterns among specific types of SDGs? And how do you measure those types of correlations?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's hard to speak in generalities because I think you need to sort of take it SDG and specific indicator by indicator. But yes, I mean, in general, we do see patterns when you're looking at, say for example, you go to the SDG Index site and you look at the data that we've compiled for different countries. You will of course see a large amount of green, so good performance for high income countries, and a much greater percentage of red for low income countries. However, they're not homogenous. It's not a case that every country has scored green on everything, or any country has scored red on everything. We've not seen that anywhere. Why that happens is, of course, in large part resources. I mean, let's be perfectly blunt. I mean, money enables policies and programs and more active interventions. It facilitates moving away from coals and cheaper forms of fossil fuel towards renewable energies and so on. So, of course, there is a basic correlation there between income per capita and productivity of the economy and certain outcomes, but not exclusively, because, of course, when we see very high income countries with very high per capita rates, the US being the prime example, but also South Africa and various others, we see very high inequality rates and the perpetuation of a great many social deprivations. South Africa, for example, has got one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world because of the huge slum population and the poor access to services within those informal settlements, in spite of the fact they have a huge amount of mineral wealth. So there are obviously immense, there are correlations between some of the dimensions, in large part because resources, so the measures of SDG 8, which is the economic productivity goal, one would expect to see a correlation with benefit, with good outcomes to do with poverty, because as we know, income does have a substantial bearing upon lifting people out of poverty, funding social interventions and so on. So that would be goal 1. But not always and not exclusively. So I think, and the other thing is to say that the top scoring countries, the Scandinavian countries, who repeatedly perform very well on a great many of the SDG dimensions, have had progressive environmental policies for a very long time. It's a nature of their political systems. They have had democratic systems for a very long time, and in particular, they have a high concentration of more liberal parties who are very ideologically aligned with strong investments in social and environmental dimensions. And so that's had very positive knock-on effects for their performance over time. So it's partly to do with income. It's partly to do with the political ideologies of the given country, and how resources and quality of education and intellectual property development, so IP registrations for technological innovations kind of spur progress in other areas. So that's really why we see some of those correlations. But as I've said, it's not homogenous. We don't see that trend everywhere. There are a number of quite low income countries who score very well. Botswana is a good example. Fairly modest national resources, but they've had very progressive policies for the last few years. They've had great health policies. They've drastically lowered things like HIV rates. And so on. So, there's no one explanation necessarily that fits all. So we have to sort of take it on a country by country basis. The other thing I should just say as a final point is that the SDG indicators are themselves quite crude, right? There are admittedly more than 240 of them, but 240 measures is not a lot when you're thinking about the complexity of the world. And so the indicators themselves are pretty basic measures, many of which really only apply to conditions that affect low and middle income countries, like acute levels of relative poverty. That indicator is not useful in a high income country where, yes, no one's living on $1.25 or $1.75 anymore, but there are huge levels of relative poverty. So in those instances, I think it's important to nuance the SDG indicators and make them more contextually relevant so that we're encouraging every country to drive forward progress wherever they're starting from. I'll stop there. Thanks.
No, thank you. I think that sort of goes partially into our next question, but also relates back to the first question where you talked about sort of a whole of government approach. So the next question asks, a lot of national statistical offices and official data collection offices are very traditional and using old-fashioned data collection, and there's not a lot of space there for innovation. So the student asks, how are we going to support a timely change to use different types of data? And I would add, given what you just said, maybe it's a separate point, but to contextualize indicators so that the data you do collect is relevant and useful. How can we support offices in making these changes in places where they maybe are a little resistant to change?
I think there's two issues here. I mean, one is resistance to change, right? There's an institutional structure in place. It's worked for many, many years. Official statisticians for national governments don't want to deviate away from the traditional methods of conducting their 10-year census, doing annual household surveys, collecting civil registration of vital statistics, and so on and so forth. You know, they've been trained in a very academic traditional style in those methodologies, and they think that they're statistically robust, and they don't want to deviate from that. The other issue is just capacity. In a great number of countries in the world, the National Statistical Office just doesn't have the bandwidth or the capacity to understand new technologies and new approaches, because they might only be a 5-man team who've got to produce all of the federal statistics for government to essentially function, or the large percentage of them, what's not already been collected in the form of administrative data by different ministries. So it's a huge burden. You know, the NSO has a very, very big and important job to do. And in the context of the SDGs, we're seeing demands for more and more and more data. Governments are increasingly talking about the need for more granular data, having more disaggregated snapshots of the well-being of their population. So being able to disaggregate by urban, by rural, by gender, by disability, by age, and so on, and having a really nuanced understanding of how their population doing, which is very important if we're going to leave no one behind. But also there's increasing requests and demands for better environmental monitoring, you know, looking at climate impacts, air pollution, you know, soil and land degradation, if we're going to cope with the huge sort of environmental overhaul we're going through at the moment. And so that places a very big burden on national statistical offices. So what, you know, we in my group SDSN Trends, and what many, many others have been advocating for a while, is that we do need to evolve the ways in which governments collect data and statistics. And rather than relying on the National Statistical Office to be the sole producer of those official statistics, we need to move to a situation where they're the curator of information. So they source reliable statistics from the public and the private sector, from NGOs who might be collecting citizen-level, citizen-generated data, but also from big private companies, be it mobile phone operators or satellite operators or so on, or university partners. And they review and they vet those statistics, and then they sort of give them, if you will, this royal approval and say this is of significant quality and can be used for informing our policy and decision making in government. So that's the shift that is being campaigned for by a great many organizations, and we're starting to see it. In the UK, just speaking from the country that I'm from, we've seen the National Statistical Office evolve into a very broad and very sophisticated unit now, with expansive Earth observation capacity, working with a great many private companies and so on, and really drawing data from a much wider pool. And the advantages of doing this is that there's less burden on this one agency. You know, they can work with a huge range of stakeholders to collate the statistics they need. So it's definitely the way to go in the modern, you know, day and age, and capitalizing on the data revolution. And we are seeing more and more willingness to evolve institutionally all over the world. Philippines, the United Arab Emirates, Ghana, we're seeing the National Statistical Offices really kind of changing the way they operate and they do business, and continuing with their important official statistics they have to collect, because those are, you know, fundamental. You know, we can't operate without a census because it's the basis upon which everything else is verified. It's the denominator for so many other statistics, but also working with these other parties to really kind of bring in their data, quality check it, ensure there's quality control, and then sharing it with broader parts of government. So that's the evolution. In terms of what we can do to help, there's a lot we can be doing to help. My research group, for example, is working right now on a program with the World Economic Forum, looking at successful legal agreements for public-private data sharing. So we're trying to understand what are the legal mechanisms you have to put in place in order to enable the government of Senegal, for example, to partner with Vodafone or Telefonica or Orange, one of the big mobile operators, in order to access their data on population movement. And how can we do that safely? And what are the legal agreements we need to do that? So we're kind of helping them devise templates for those kind of agreements so that it will be much easier for them to negotiate those agreements in future. So that's the kind of thing we can do to help ease the administrative, legal, and institutional burdens to this kind of innovation.
Do you know if there are any international standards for that, or is this sort of a very new area of with these legal agreements that you're sort of putting together?
It's a good question. No, it's case law, right? So we're drawing upon examples of cases that have already happened and then identifying good practice. I'm working with various lawyers from the World Economic Forum and University of Washington and various others to kind of make recommendations on what seems to be effective and is being commonly used. And there are hundreds of examples around the world of public-private data sharing agreements that we can draw upon. So we're not sort of doing anything original necessarily. We're just making it a lot more accessible, particularly for low-income countries. Governments who might not have strong, legal partnerships or counsel to advise them. In terms of are there kind of good precedences in place around these kind of things? I mean, yes, there's extensive literature on public-private partnerships. The OECD's principles for PPPs, for example, being a good guiding framework for these kinds of arrangements. So there is a lot out there that we can draw upon, and there's a lot of great examples already. The challenge is making it kind of accessible and making those institutional arrangements easy so that more and more countries can do it and can partner with private entities in order to produce the data they need.
Okay, great. And I think our last question here is sort of feeds right into that about this public-private partnership. And the student was asking if you have any particular examples on data sharing, specifically around if you know of anything that's happening with the Ebola epidemic in Africa. I know in your lectures you talk about flu trends. You talk about the data that helps the World Health Organization know where to set up its clinics and track disease. So I didn't. If there's any, do you know of anything happening right now that you think is particularly helpful or useful, or generating a lot of interesting data, or what's the next trend in gathering health information?
I can't speak specifically to the DRC, I'm afraid, but I can cite an example from other parts of West Africa, Ghana and Senegal, where Orange, the mobile phone operator, have been working very closely with the governments there, as well as with a group called World Data Pop, which is based at the University of Southampton, to open up access to mobile telecommunications data so that we can track migration patterns. So what that helps us do is understand, using health administrative data, where a particular disease outbreak is. So we can see, okay, the Ebola outbreak is currently confined to the northeast part of the country. And then we can look using mobile phone data, so looking literally at people's movements from cell tower to cell tower and tracking their phone's movement. We can see how people are moving around the country. So you could see, are there trends of people moving from the northeast of the country to the southwest of the country? And statistically speaking, how much does that increase the chance of Ebola being spread in this particular corridor? And so then you can put in place health measures to mitigate that. So you can make sure that there are health checkpoints that would be monitoring people's health and well-being as they move across different parts of the country. You could make sure that on that corridor, of that migratory corridor, maybe it's people commuting to a city, maybe it's people commuting to see relatives, and there's sort of a common trend of that happening. You can make sure that health clinics are stocked with appropriate drugs and with equipment to be able to cope with cases as they come in. So it gives you the ability to predict trends, and then with that information, you can better tailor your health service prevention. So, I think telecommunications data and using that for migratory patterns is hugely exciting and interesting, and adds there's a lot of potential. You can also do some other very clever things with mobile phone data now. You can generally discern, not always, but you can get broad trends of whether it's female versus male owners, how many people are using the phone, that kind of thing. So you can get a good sense of household dynamics, who are more prone to be moving in certain areas, and then correlate that with their disease burdens. So yeah, there's a lot of exciting innovation going on right now in this field, particularly with telecommunications data, but not exclusively, also with a lot of satellite imagery and Earth observation, which again can help us see using night lights, kind of migratory patterns, and so on. So that really helps us monitor epidemics. But yeah, it's early days. It's early days in this kind of innovation, but it's becoming more and more common. And I'm optimistic that in 5-10 years from now, this is going to become the norm, and we're going to have a much better ability to really predict health outbreaks as they happen or in advance of them happening, and be able to respond with appropriate health services more effectively.
Yeah, thank you. I found it interesting, the flu trends and other types of data collection that looks at people's search history, general trends in search history, or what are people tweeting about. I always find that Twitter seems to be the fastest measure of what's going on, just as a way to use people's real lived experiences and translate that into data that can be used to.
Mm-hmm. And that's a good example. It is a very exciting field. It should be said that, of course, that only really works with the connected, right? People with very good e-access. Most people in the world now have a mobile phone, or at least access to a mobile phone. The vast majority do anyway, but fewer people have access to high-speed internet for things like Twitter and social media. So those kinds of predictive measures only really work in very very well-connected societies. But particularly in the United States, Latin America, much of Europe, parts of Southeast Asia, we can use those models to predict at least basic epidemics and sort of outbreaks very effectively. Yeah, so that's a good example of kind of big data being applied for the public good.
Yeah, and thank you. That's an important point as well, is to differentiate between types of access, even when people do have, the majority of people now have some sort of mobile access. But yeah, we are coming up on our time, so I just wanted to thank you very much for participating in this Q&A and for being part of the course. I think that the data and statistics portion of our course is sort of a theme throughout, and I'm really glad that we had a chance to focus in on it specifically about the importance of indicators and finding the right indicators, and then finding the right data to support those, and the opportunities that new innovations in ICT presents for that. So thank you very much, and love to let you wrap up. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, thanks to you, and thanks to everyone who's participating again. I'm very available if you have more questions or specific things you want to fire to me via email. We'll share my email address in the chat, but it's just jessica.espey@unsdsn.org. You can find me online as well. So do send any more questions or queries you might have. And also, I just encourage you to really, read as much as you can in this area. There is so much innovation going on right now in big data, and the use of new data technologies for the social good, monitoring performance and improvements. So it's really an exciting field. And I think for those of you who are at the beginnings of your careers, this is really an exploding area of work. So I would really encourage you to think about maybe doing a bit more research or a bit more training in data science, looking at the classical statistical methods, which are hugely important, but also looking at things like Earth observation and GIS data, and so on. And the more exposure you can get to those kind of things, I think the more useful you'll find it in your future careers. So best of luck to you all. Enjoy the rest of the course, and do send me any further questions you might have. Thanks.